It actually happened. The police report states that Julian fled the country, that he's sipping Mai Tais on a non-extradition beach somewhere in Southeast Asia, but I know that isn't true. Julian never left. He is still there, scattered in microscopic fragments beneath the freshly poured concrete of that basement floor. Even now, 6 months later, and 2 states away, whenever I catch the sharp chemical sting of industrial-strength bleach mixed with the copper tang of wet rust, I hear that music again. It starts as a low thrum in the base of my skull, a rhythmic pounding that mimics a heartbeat but lacks the warmth of blood. I used to think it was just a rich kid's party, a bass-heavy annoyance drifting through the damp Oregon pines. I tried to explain it away with logic, telling myself it was just bad insulation or the wind playing tricks in the valley. But wind doesn't laugh with the same pitch-perfect cadence every 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Wind doesn't wear a human face like a mask that's slipping off at the edges. I moved to Pinecrest to bury a version of myself that I no longer recognized. After the layoff in Seattle and the messy, screaming end of a 5-year engagement, I needed silence. I needed the kind of isolation that only money and geography can buy. Pinecrest was advertised as an exclusive sanctuary, a sprawling development carved out of the dense, mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest. The houses here were architectural marvels of glass and steel, placed strategically far apart to ensure that no resident ever had to accidentally acknowledge another human being's existence. It was perfect. It was a sterile cage where I could work, sleep, and forget. My house was a 3-story modernist cube jutting out from the hillside like a jagged tooth. The selling point for me was the 3rd-floor office. It was a glass-walled command center that offered a panoramic view of the valley below a sea of evergreen trees that looked almost black under the perpetual gray sky. I spent the first week unpacking in a fugue state, setting up my servers and monitors, arranging my life into neat, manageable piles. I work in data recovery and analysis, a job that requires long, nocturnal hours staring at cascading lines of code. It turns you into a creature of the night, a silent observer of a sleeping world. That was when I noticed the anomaly of the property next door. In a neighborhood designed for privacy, where driveways were long, winding ribbons of asphalt, meant to hide the homes from the street, the house to my left felt intrusive. It sat uncomfortably close to the property line, a massive, brutalist structure of dark gray stone and tinted windows that seemed to absorb the weak sunlight rather than reflect it. While the other houses in Pinecrest were nestled into the landscape, this one loomed over it, an artificial monolith dropped into the wilderness. It was too big for one person, too silent for a family, and too clean for reality. I tried to be a good neighbor. I really did. It's an antiquated concept, I know, especially for a guy in his late 20s who spends more time talking to algorithms than people, but I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't entirely broken. I wasn't going to be the creeping hermit of Pinecrest. So on a Tuesday afternoon, when the fog had momentarily lifted enough to see the street, I walked down my driveway and up his. The silence of the neighborhood was heavy, almost pressurized. There were no birds singing, no distant hum of traffic, just the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel. As I approached the front door of the gray house, I noticed the BMW in the driveway. It was a sleek black M5 parked with military precision. It gleamed under the overcast sky, polished to a mirror finish, but as I walked past it, I noticed something odd. The tires were pristine. Not just clean, but untouched. There was no road dust in the treads, no mud splatter on the wheel wells, despite the fact that the road up to Pinecrest was a winding, dirt-packed nightmare in the rain. It looked like the car had been placed there by a giant hand, a prop on a movie set, waiting for the director to call action. I shook off the thought. Paranoia, I told myself. Maybe he just washed it. Maybe he's obsessive about detailing. I adjusted the 6-pack of craft beer I was carrying, a peace offering, and rang the doorbell. The chime was deep and resonant, echoing inside the house as if the interior was a vast, hollow cavern. I waited. I shifted my weight. I checked my watch. 1 minute passed, then 2. I was about to turn around relieved that I could go back to my solitude with my social obligation technically fulfilled when the lock clicked. It didn't slide or tumble. It snapped open with a sharp mechanical crack. The door swung inward, and I was hit with a smell that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't a bad smell exactly. It was the smell of newness, amplified to a nauseating degree. It smelled like fresh vinyl, uncured paint, and shrink-wrapped plastic layered over something sterile and cold like the air in a server room. "Hello." The voice was loud, too loud for the distance between us, and it cut through the quiet like a glass shard. The man standing in the doorway was younger than I expected. He looked to be about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a trendy, shaggy mullet haircut that was making an ironic comeback in the city. He wore a vintage, oversized band t-shirt and expensive streetwear cargo pants. He was handsome in a generic, commercially viable way, like a background actor in a soda commercial who had been given a speaking role by mistake. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile that felt tight on my face. "I'm Mason. I just moved in next door. Saw you were around and thought I'd say hi. Brought some local IPA." I held up the beer. He looked at the bottles, then at my face, then back at the bottles. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, and for a second they didn't seem to focus on anything. They just scanned the surface of the object. "Oh, wow!" he exclaimed, the enthusiasm dialing up from 0 to 100 in a split second. "A neighbor. That is so cool. Someone born in my decade. What a nice surprise." He flashed a smile that showed too many teeth. They were blindingly white, uniform, and straight. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His lower face was engaged in performance while his upper face remained dead calm. "Yeah," I laughed nervously. "It's a bit of a retirement community vibe out here, right? Thought us young guys should stick together." "Stick together," he repeated. He didn't phrase it as a question or an agreement. He just said the words testing their weight. "I'm Julian." "Nice to meet you, Julian. You want to crack one open, celebrate the neighborhood?" I gestured to the beer again, stepping slightly forward, expecting him to step back and invite me in. That was the social contract. That was the script. Julian didn't move. He stood planted in the center of the doorway, blocking any view of the interior with his body. He wasn't physically imposing. He was lean, almost wiry, but there was a rigidity to his posture that was unnerving. "I wish I could," Julian said, his smile dropping by exactly 15%. "But I am swamped, working. You know how it is, the grind." "Oh, sure," I said, stepping back. "What do you do?" "Finance," he said immediately. "Stocks, crypto." He paused. It was a micropause, a tiny glitch in the conversation flow. "Finance," he repeated with the exact same inflection as the first time. "Markets, fluctuating, volatility, keeps me busy." He was throwing out buzzwords like he had memorized a glossary but didn't know the grammar. I nodded, deciding not to press. Maybe he was just high. Or maybe he was some trust fund kid playing day trader with daddy's money and didn't want to be exposed. "I get it," I said. "I work from home too. Data analysis, it keeps me up all hours." Julian's head cocked to the side, a motion that was more avian than human. "Data," he said softly. "Information, that's valuable." "Right. Well, I'll leave you to it. Maybe another time." "Another time," Julian echoed. "Absolutely. We should definitely interface." He didn't say hang out. He said interface. Before I could respond, he began to close the door. But just before the gap narrowed, I caught a glimpse over his shoulder. The foyer behind him was expansive, with high ceilings and a grand staircase curving upward, but it was empty. I don't mean minimalist, I mean empty. There was no rug on the hardwood floor, no table for keys, no art on the walls. And in the far back, where the living room should have been, I saw a single folding metal chair sitting in the middle of the vast, empty space facing the wall. The door clicked shut. The lock snapped home with that same aggressive finality. I stood on his porch for a moment, the silence rushing back in to fill the void Julian's voice had left. I looked down at the six-pack in my hand, feeling foolish. As I walked back down the driveway, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It's a primal instinct, a biological warning system evolved over millions of years to tell you when a predator is tracking you through the long grass. I forced myself not to run, but I walked briskly. When I reached the safety of my own garage, I turned back to look at the gray house. The curtains on the second floor twitched, just once. That night the insomnia set in. It wasn't unusual for me, my sleep schedule had been shattered for years, but this felt different. It wasn't the restless energy of anxiety, it was the cold alertness of survival. I sat in my office on the third floor, bathed in the blue glow of 3 monitors scrolling through terabytes of corrupted data for a client in Portland. But my eyes kept drifting to the window. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of Julian's property. The way the land sloped meant that my third floor looked directly down into his second floor in the backyard. The darkness of Pinecrest was absolute at night. There were no street lights, only the ambient gray of the moon filtering through the clouds. Julian's house was a black void except for one window on the ground floor. It wasn't illuminated by a warm lamp or a television. It was a stark white light, harsh and clinical, like the lighting in a hospital operating theater or a laboratory. Shadows moved across that light periodically. I found myself timing them. 11:15 p.m., shadow moves left to right. 11:28 p.m., shadow moves right to left. 11:41 p.m., shadow moves left to right. It was rhythmic, too rhythmic. I tried to focus on my code, burying myself in the logic of Python and Skewl, but the pattern next door scratched at the back of my brain. I told myself he was pacing. People pace when they're stressed, when they're on the phone, when they're thinking. It's normal. He's a finance bro, I rationalized. Probably losing his shirt on the Asian markets right now, pacing the floor, screaming into a headset. But the shadow didn't look like a pacing man. It was stiff. It moved with a smooth gliding quality, lacking the vertical bob of a human step. Days turned into a week, then 2. The strange interaction at the door began to fade into the background noise of my life, replaced by the mundane reality of my own isolation. I fell into a routine. Wake up at noon, coffee, work until 4 a.m. sleep. I barely left the house. I ordered groceries online, leaving instructions for the delivery driver to leave them at the gate. I was becoming exactly what I feared a ghost in my own life, but I justified it as healing. I was detoxing from people. However, my nightly vigil at the window became a habit I couldn't break. I started noticing the details that were absent. In 2 weeks, I never saw Julian leave the house. The BMW sat in the exact same spot, the tire positioning unchanged. No food delivery drivers ever went up his driveway. No mail carrier ever stopped at his box. The only activity I saw occurred every Thursday morning just before dawn. A nondescript white van would pull up to the service entrance of his house. 2 men in gray coveralls would get out, unload several large, heavy cardboard boxes and leave them by the side door. Then they would take black trash bags from the house, heavy bags that didn't bulge with the irregular shapes of household refuse, but sagged with a dense, wet weight, and throw them into the back of the van. I zoomed in with a pair of binoculars I had bought for bird watching, a hobby I had aspired to pick up but never did. The cardboard boxes being delivered were labeled with chemical hazard diamonds. I recognized the logo on one of them from my time working IT for a janitorial supply chain years ago. It was industrial caustic soda, the kind used to strip floors or dissolve organic blockages in commercial plumbing. He's renovating, I told myself, doing the work himself inside. That explains the empty rooms, the paint smell, the chemicals. It was a flimsy lie, but it was better than the alternative, which was admitting that my neighbor was existing in a way that defied biological necessity. Then came the night of the statue. It was a Tuesday again, exactly 3 weeks after I'd moved in. The fog was particularly thick, pressing against the glass of my office like a physical weight. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from screen glare, and I stood up to stretch. I walked to the window, sipping a glass of stale water, and looked down at Julian's house. The harsh white light was on in the living room now, the big window facing my property. The curtains were drawn back. Julian was standing there. He was facing my house, facing me. He was standing in the center of the window frame, perfectly still. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't holding a drink. He wasn't moving a muscle. He was just standing, arms at his side, staring up at the darkness where my house sat. I froze. The tint on my windows and the darkness of my room meant he shouldn't be able to see me. I was invisible, but I felt seen. I felt a gaze that penetrated the glass, in the distance a cold, tactile sensation on my skin. I checked the time. 2:03 a.m. I went back to my desk, sat down, and tried to work. But I couldn't. 5 minutes later, I looked back. He hadn't moved. 20 minutes later, he hadn't moved. An hour passed. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. I pulled up the feed from my external security cameras on my second monitor. I had a camera mounted on the corner of my eaves that caught a sliver of his yard. On the digital screen, the image was grainy and black and white, but clear enough. There he was, a pixelated figure in the window. I watched the timestamp on the video feed tick by. 3:15 a.m., 3:45 a.m., 4:20 a.m. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't scratch his nose. He didn't blink. No human being can stand that still for that long. It goes against physiology. Muscles twitch, blood pools, balance corrects. We are creatures of constant micro-movement. But Julian stood there like a mannequin forgotten in a display case. At 4:45 a.m., as the first hint of gray dawn began to bleed into the sky, the light in his room abruptly cut out. He didn't walk away and flip a switch. The darkness just swallowed him instantly. I sat there in my expensive ergonomic chair, shivering uncontrollably. Logic tried to build a defense. He was meditating. It was a prank. He fell asleep standing up. But deep down in the lizard brain that remembers when we were prey, I knew the truth. That wasn't a man deep in thought. That was something waiting on standby. That was a machine idling, waiting for a command input. I didn't sleep that day. I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening to the silence of the house, terrified that if I closed them, I would wake up and find that smiling plastic face hovering over me. That evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, stretching across the gap between our houses like grasping fingers, I decided I needed to know. I needed to prove to myself that I was crazy. If I was crazy, that was fine. I could deal with crazy. I could take pills for crazy. I couldn't deal with this. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a trash bag, pretending to take out my garbage. I walked down the driveway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I glanced at his house, dark, quiet. I walked to the property line. The air grew colder here, a localized drop in temperature that pricked at my skin. I sniffed the air. Underneath the scent of pine needles and damp earth, there it was, faint but undeniable, bleach and something else. Ozone, the smell of an electrical storm or a short circuit. I looked at the ground near his fence. The grass there was dead. Not yellowed from lack of water, but gray and brittle, as if the soil itself had been sterilized. And sitting there half hidden by a fern was a small object. I reached through the fence and picked it up. It was a bird, a robin. It was perfectly intact. No wounds, no missing feathers, no sign of a cat attack. But it was stiff as a board, its eyes wide open and clouded over. I held a tiny corpse in my hand, and I realized it wasn't just dead. It was hollow. It felt weightless, like a shell. I pressed my thumb against its chest, and the feathers crunched. There was no meat underneath, no bone, just dry, papery resistance. I dropped the bird and wiped my hand on my jeans, suppressing the urge to vomit. "Hey, neighbor," the voice came from directly behind me. I spun around, nearly tripping over my own feet. Julian was standing there, right on the other side of the fence, not 3 feet away. I hadn't heard him approach. Not a footstep, not a rustle of fabric. He was wearing the same clothes as the day we met. The band t-shirt, the cargos. He was smiling. That same wide, blinding white smile. "Taking out the trash?" he asked. His eyes were locked onto my hand, the one that had touched the bird. "Yeah," I croaked. My throat felt like it was full of sand. "Just cleaning up." "Cleaning is good," Julian said. Hygiene is essential for system maintenance. He leaned closer to the fence. In the twilight, his skin looked waxy, the pores too uniform. "You look tired, Mason," he said. The concern in his voice sounded synthesized, like a text-to-speech program reading a sympathy card. "You should sleep. The walls here are thick, but not thick enough to block out everything." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice rising in a panic I couldn't control. Julian's smile didn't waver, but his head tilted again, that sharp, bird-like snap. "It means," he whispered, and for the first time his voice dropped an octave, sounding like two stones grinding together deep underwater, "that tonight is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays we celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "Life," he said, "or the approximation of it." He turned and walked away, back toward his dark, monolithic house. He moved with a fluidity that was almost liquid, his upper body completely still, while his legs carried him forward. I watched him go, and that's when I saw it. On the back of his neck, just below the hairline where his mullet ended, there was a patch of skin that was a different color than the rest. It was a square, darker patch. It looked like an adhesive label that had been peeled off, leaving a sticky residue behind. I ran back to my house, locked the door, and engaged the deadbolt. I checked the windows. I checked the back door. I turned off all the lights in the house, plunging myself into darkness, and crawled up the stairs to my office. I sat in the dark, staring at the glowing numbers of my digital clock. 1:58 a.m., 1:59 a.m., 2:00 a.m., thump, it started. A heavy rhythmic bass line erupted from the house next door. It vibrated through the ground, through the foundation of my house, and settled into my teeth. It was loud, incredibly loud, but muffled, as if the source was buried deep underground. I crawled to the window and peeked through the blinds. The driveway was full. 7 black SUVs, identical to the ones used by government agencies or high-end security firms, were lined up in the driveway. They sat there in the dark, engines off, lights off. No one got out. No one went in, and the music pumped on. Thump, thump, thump. But then, over the bass, I heard it. The sounds of a party. Clinking glasses, laughter, high heels on hardwood floors, a roar of conversation. It sounded like there were 100 people in that house. It sounded like the Great Gatsby was throwing a rager next door. But the windows of the gray house remained dark. No silhouettes danced, no shadows moved, and as I listened, really listened, straining my ears against the glass, the blood drained from my face. A woman laughed. It was a bright, cascading laugh, high-pitched, ha-ha-ha-he. I waited. Exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds later, ha-ha-ha-he, the exact same pitch, the exact same duration, the exact same inflection. I grabbed my phone and opened the stopwatch app. I waited. The bass throbbed. The glasses clinked. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Ha-ha-ha-he. I wasn't listening to a party. I was listening to a recording, a loop, a seamless, high-fidelity audio file being blasted at concert volume into the empty night. Why? Why would anyone do that? Why play the sounds of life in a house of death? As I stared down at the dark house, trying to make sense of the madness, the front door of Julian's house opened. Light spilled out onto the driveway. But it wasn't the warm light of a hallway. It was the harsh blue-white light of the laboratory again. And lying there on the threshold, illuminated by the glare, was a pair of shoes. Just one pair. My shoes. The old running sneakers I had left on my back porch, the ones I wore to mow the lawn. They were sitting neatly in Julian's doorway, facing inward, inviting me in. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was a guest, and the party was just getting started. I didn't step across that threshold, not that night. Fear is a biological mechanic, a sudden dump of cortisol and adrenaline designed to override higher brain functions and force the body into motion. When I saw my own Nike running sneakers dirty, frayed at the laces, the rubber soles worn unevenly from my supination sitting perfectly centered in the halo of clinical blue light spilling from Julian's foyer, my brain didn't process it as a prank. It processed it as a threat assessment. Those shoes had been on my back porch behind a locked gate not 20 minutes ago. I didn't scream. I didn't call out. I turned and sprinted back to my house, the darkness of the yard whipping past me like a physical assault. I scrambled up my own porch steps, my socks slipping on the damp wood, and slammed the back door shut. I threw the deadbolt. I engaged the chain. I dragged a heavy oak kitchen chair and wedged it under the doorknob. Then, breathless and shaking violently, I went to the window to look at my back porch. The spot where I kept my gardening shoes was empty. There was no mud trail, no footprint, just a blank, dry rectangle on the decking where the shoes had been shielding the wood from the morning mist. Someone had entered my property, bypassed my security gate without triggering the motion sensor, walked silently up to my back door while I was inside and taken them. They hadn't taken the expensive grill. They hadn't tried to break in. They had taken my shoes and placed them at his door. It was an invitation. It was a summons. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the corner of my third-floor office, clutching a heavy Maglite flashlight, watching the monitor feeds. The party next door raged on. The bass thumped against the walls of my house, a relentless, dull headache that pulsed behind my eyes. Thump, thump, thump. The laughter looped, the glasses clinked, but Julian's door remained open, spilling that light onto the driveway onto my stolen shoes. At 4:12 a.m., the music cut out mid-beat. No fade-out, no last call, just silence. On my monitor, I watched as the 7 black SUVs started their engines simultaneously. There were no drivers getting in. The doors never opened. The brake lights just flared red in the darkness. 7 pairs of demonic eyes waking up. They pulled out of the driveway in a perfect convoy, moving with synchronized precision, and vanished down the winding road into the fog. Then Julian appeared in the doorway. He stepped out, picked up my shoes, and carried them inside. The door clicked shut. The lock snapped. That was the moment the curiosity died and the obsession began. For the next 6 days, I didn't leave my house. I ceased to be Mason, the freelance data analyst. I became a ghost in the machine, a digital voyeur barricaded in a glass tower. I told myself I was gathering evidence for the police, but deep down I knew the police wouldn't understand. You can't call 911 because your neighbor stole your old sneakers and plays loud music. You need proof. You need something concrete. I ordered equipment. Same-day delivery from Amazon, instructed to be dropped over the fence. I bought a shotgun microphone, the kind used for birding or surveillance. I bought a high-fidelity audio interface. I bought a telescope with a camera adapter. I turned my office into a command center. I moved my mattress onto the floor so I wouldn't have to leave the room to sleep. I lived on energy drinks and dry cereal, my eyes glued to the screens, my ears protected by noise-canceling headphones, amplifying the signal from the shotgun mic pointed directly at Julian's living room window. I learned his routine. And the more I watched, the less he looked like a man and the more he looked like a looped script. Every morning at 8:00 a.m. sharp, the blinds in the master bedroom would open. Not casually, but instantly, as if triggered by a timer. At 8:15 a.m., Julian would appear in the kitchen window. He would hold a coffee mug. He would lift it to his lips, tilt his head back, and lower it. I zoomed in with the telescope. The mug was empty. I could see the clean white ceramic of the bottom interior. There was no steam, no liquid residue. He was pantomiming the act of drinking coffee. At 12:00 p.m., he would move to the living room. He would sit on that single metal folding chair I had glimpsed on the first day. He would sit there for exactly 4 hours facing the blank wall. He didn't read. He didn't look at a phone. He just sat, spine-rigid, hands on his knees. At 4:00 p.m., he would stand up and walk to the window. He would stare at my house. This was the part that broke me. He knew I was watching. He had to. Even though my lights were off and my blinds were angled, he would look directly into the lens of my telescope. He would smile that terrible, blinding white smile and wave. A small, stiff wave. Hello, neighbor. It wasn't a wave of greeting. It was a wave of acknowledgement. I see you seeing me. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the staring, it was the glitches. On Friday, watching the feed, I saw him walking from the kitchen to the hallway. Halfway across the room, he stopped. His left leg twitched. Then he took a step back. Then he took the same step forward, then back, then forward. He did this 17 times, forward, back, forward, back. It looked exactly like a video game character stuck on a piece of geometry, their walk cycle looping until the code corrected itself. I sat there, my breath fogging the air in my cold office, whispering, "What are you?" He wasn't human. Humans have variance. Humans have chaos. Julian was absolute order masked in a meat suit. By Tuesday night, I was a wreck. I hadn't showered in 4 days. My beard was itching, my skin felt tight and greasy, and the smell of ozone seemed to have permeated my house, seeping through the walls like a gas. I was jumping at shadows. The hum of my own refrigerator sounded like whispering voices, but I was ready. I had set up the shotgun mic on a tripod, aimed through the cracked window of my office. The signal was routed into Pro Tools on my main workstation. I had a frequency analyzer plug-in open, ready to visualize the sound. If the party happened again, I was going to dissect it. I was going to strip it down to its binary bones and find the error. Wednesday, 1:59 a.m. I sat in the dark, the glow of the monitors illuminating my face. The silence of Pinecrest was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the world. Then the vibration started. It wasn't sound at first. It was a tremor in the floorboards. My water glass rippled. Thump. The first beat hit like a physical blow. The waveform on my screen spiked red. Thump, thump. The black SUVs arrived. I didn't even look at them this time. I didn't care about the cars. I cared about the noise. "Come on," I whispered, my hand hovering over the record button. "Talk to me." The party noise began. The clinking, the laughter, the murmur of a crowd. I hit record. The waveform began to populate the screen, a jagged mountain range of blue data. I put on my headphones and cranked the gain. Through the high-end audio equipment, the party sounded horrifying. To the naked ear, it sounded like a gathering. But magnified and isolated, the artificiality was undeniable. The laughter lacked breath. There were no inhales, only the percussive sound of the laugh itself. The clinking glasses had no resonance. It was a sharp digital ping that cut off too quickly, lacking the natural decay of crystal vibrating in air. I watched the timeline. 4 minutes, 4 minutes and 10 seconds, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Ha 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 he. There it was, the woman's laugh. I placed a marker on the timeline. I waited. The waveform scrolled. The bass drum kicked in a relentless 4/4 time signature that never varied in velocity. A human drummer or even a DJ mixing tracks introduces micro variations. This was quantized to the grid. It was mathematically perfect. It was dead. 4 minutes and 12 seconds later. Ha 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 he. I lined up the two waveforms. They were identical, down to the sample. It was the same audio file being re-triggered. "Got you," I hissed. "It's a tape. It's just a tape." "But why go to this expense? Why the cars? Why the lights? If it's just a recording, why the pageantry?" I started applying filters. I used a high-pass filter to cut out the booming bass, isolating the mid-range frequencies where the human voices sat. I wanted to hear what they were saying. I scrubbed through the conversation noise. It was gibberish. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language. It was phonemes spliced together. Galabata soso mimi. It was the auditory uncanny valley sounds that mimic speech patterns but contain no information. Then I applied a low-pass filter, cutting out the highs and mids, focusing only on the sub-bass frequencies, the rumble beneath the music. That's when I saw it. On the frequency analyzer, buried deep in the 20 Hz range, a frequency so low it's felt more than heard, a frequency often associated with feelings of dread and nausea, there was a pattern. It wasn't music. It was Morse code, no, too complex. It was a rhythm, scratch. Grind, wet thud, scratch, grind, wet thud. I boosted the gain on that specific frequency range plus 20 dB. It nearly blew my speakers. I listened. It sounded like machinery. heavy industrial machinery, the sound of metal teeth biting into something soft, meeting resistance, and then snapping through. Grrr, snap, squelch. My stomach turned over. I recognized that sound. I had grown up on a farm in Idaho. I knew the sound of a wood chipper. I knew the sound of a bone saw. This was the sound of a slaughterhouse slowed down and buried under a layer of techno beats. I sat back, ripping the headphones off. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The party wasn't a party. It was sound masking. It was a sonic camouflage designed to hide the industrial processing happening in that house. But then the recording glitched. It was 3:45 a.m. I was watching the waveform when a sharp vertical spike appeared in the data. It didn't fit the loop. It was an anomaly. I zoomed in on the spike. It lasted only 0.5 seconds. I isolated it. I slowed it down by 50%. I pressed play. "Help me." It was a whisper, a man's voice, hoarse, terrified, breathless. It sounded like it was recorded from inside a box or inside a wall. I played it again. "Help me!" It was Julian's voice. I froze. I looked out the window at the figure standing in the living room window of the gray house. The silhouette was there, backlit by the strobe lights, bobbing its head to the music. If that was Julian in the window, whose voice was on the tape, or worse, if the Julian in the window was the thing in charge, was the real Julian, the one screaming in the mix, the anomaly didn't repeat. The loop corrected itself. Ha 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 he, I needed to know. The logic of self-preservation that had kept me locked in my house for a week shattered under the weight of that single whispered plea. It was the call to the void. It was the irrational human need to see the horror with one's own eyes. I grabbed the maglite. I grabbed a pocket knife, a pathetic 3-inch blade I used to open Amazon boxes. I put on my boots, my hiking boots, since my sneakers were gone. I went downstairs. The air outside was freezing. The fog was so thick I could taste it, a metallic chemical taste that coated my tongue. The music from Julian's house was deafening out here. The ground shook under my feet. I walked to the property line. I climbed the fence, the wood slick with condensation. I crept through the shadows of the shrubbery, moving toward the side of the house where the black SUVs were parked. Up close, the cars were even more terrifying. The windows were tinted so dark they were opaque. I put my face near the glass of the rear passenger door of the closest SUV. I shielded my eyes and peered in. It was empty, but not just empty of people. It was stripped. There were no seats, no dashboard, no steering wheel. It was just a hollow metal shell on wheels, a prop, a stage decoration. I backed away, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I moved to the front of the house. The front door, the massive oak double door, was wide open again. The light spilled out, and there in the foyer were the shoes. My sneakers were gone, but now the foyer was filled with shoes, hundreds of them. They were lined up in perfect military rows, high heels, work boots, sandals, children's sneakers, loafers. They were all facing the interior of the house, and they were all filthy, not with street dust but with red clay, the same red clay that clung to the roots of the ancient pines in the deep forest behind our subdivision. I stepped onto the porch. The music was so loud now it felt like it was rearranging my internal organs. I looked at the shoes nearest to me, a pair of delicate red stiletto heels. Inside the left heel there was something wet. I shone my flashlight into it. It was a severed toe. The nail was painted red to match the shoe. The flesh was gray. The bone was jagged. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't a party. This was a collection, a depository. And then the music stopped. It didn't cut out like before. It wound down, like a turntable losing power. The pitch dropped. The laughter turned into a demonic groan. The bass slowed to a dying heartbeat. Woob, woob, woob. Click. Silence. I stood on the porch, exposed, terrified. From deep inside the house, from the darkness beyond the foyer full of shoes, a sound emerged. It wasn't a footstep, it was the whir of a servo motor. Zzz, and then a voice. It was Julian's voice, but it was coming from everywhere at once, projected through the hidden PA system. "Mason!" The voice boomed flat and devoid of emotion. "You are early. The processing queue is full, but we can make an exception." I turned to run. I had to run. But the door behind me, the door leading back to the safety of the street, slammed shut. It didn't just swing shut. It slammed with the force of a hydraulic ram. I was trapped in the foyer. The row of shoes seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark living room, and now I could hear it. Beneath the silence of the house, the sound from my recording was real. Grind, grind, grind. The wood chipper was running in the basement, and the smell of bleach was suddenly so strong it burned the lining of my nose, making my eyes water, blurring my vision. I looked toward the back of the foyer, toward the open archway that led to the darkness. A figure stepped out. It was Julian, but he wasn't wearing his cargo pants and band tee. He was naked, and he wasn't finished. His skin was pale, almost translucent plastic, but down his chest there was a long, vertical seam that hadn't been sealed. It gaped open, revealing not muscle and blood, but a cavity filled with black wire and pulsating wet insulation foam. His face was smiling, that same fixed smile. "Do you like the music, Mason?" he asked. His jaw didn't move. The sound came from a speaker embedded in his throat. "It helps cover the screams. Organic units make so much noise when they are recycled." He took a step toward me. Zzzt. I looked at the shoes. I looked at the door. I looked at the unfinished thing that called itself a neighbor. "What are you?" I whispered. Julian tilted his head. The seam on his chest widened and a blue light pulsed from within his ribcage. "I am the reception committee," he said, "and you are the guest of honor." He raised a hand. His fingers were too long. They had too many joints. "Please," he said, "take off your shoes. We like to keep the floor clean." I didn't think. I didn't rationalize. I threw the flashlight at his face. It struck him with a wet thud, cracking the plastic skin of his cheek. No blood flowed, just a spark of electricity. He didn't flinch. He just kept coming. I turned to the only exit left. Not the front door, it was sealed. Not the living room, that was where the monster was. To my right there was a small door, a closet, a pantry. I threw myself at it, twisting the knob. It opened. It wasn't a closet, it was a staircase, steep, wooden, and descending into a red-lit abyss. The smell of copper and rot billowed up from below, warm and humid. The sound of the grinder was deafening now. Grind, grind, grind. "No running in the house, Mason," the Julian thing said, its voice distorting, dropping into a demonic bass. I looked back. He was sprinting now. Not running like a human, but skittering his limbs, moving in a blur of impossible angles, like a spider made of mannequin parts. I had no choice. I plunged into the darkness of the stairs, slamming the door behind me and holding it shut with my shoulder, praying to a God I hadn't believed in for years that the lock would hold against the thing on the other side. I was in the basement, and the party was just getting started. The door behind me shook. It wasn't the frantic rattling of a human trying to force a lock. It was a singular hydraulic impact, like a battering ram made of synthetic bone hitting the wood. The frame groaned, plaster dust raining down from the header, coating my hair in a fine white powder that smelled like crushed drywall and old fear. "Open the door, Mason." The voice vibrated through the wood. It was the Julian thing, the plastic-skinned mannequin from the foyer. But the voice had lost its friendly, neighborly modulation. It was now a distorted, multi-tonal screech, the sound of a corrupted audio file tearing itself apart. "We need to calibrate your inseam. We need to measure your capacity." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My lungs were seized in a spasm of pure primal panic. I pressed my shoulder harder against the wood, my boots sliding on the linoleum of the landing, praying that the deadbolt I had instinctively thrown would hold against the monster on the other side. Thud. The door bowed inward. A hairline crack appeared in the center panel. I couldn't stay here. If I stayed, that door would splinter, and that thing with the exposed wiring in its chest would drag me into the foyer to join the collection of empty shoes. I turned away from the door and looked down. The staircase wasn't finished. That was the first thing my brain processed through the adrenaline haze. The upper house, the Julian residence, was a marvel of modern architecture, hardwood, glass, steel. But this staircase was raw, untreated lumber hastily nailed together. It looked like a construction site scaffold leading down into a black throat. And the air, God, the air. It billowed up from the darkness below, thick and wet, hitting my face like a physical slap. It didn't smell like a basement. It didn't smell like mildew or damp earth. It smelled like a swimming pool filled with rotting meat. The chemical sting of industrial-grade chlorine was so potent it burned the mucous membranes of my nose, instantly making my eyes stream with tears. But underneath the bleach, weaving through it like a venomous snake, was the copper penny stench of blood. Not old, dried blood, fresh, hot, oxygenated blood. Grind, grind, grind. The sound was deafening down here. It wasn't just a noise, it was a pressure wave. It resonated in the hollow space of my chest cavity. It was the sound of heavy torque of steel teeth chewing through resistance. I took the first step down. The wood creaked a high-pitched protest that was instantly swallowed by the mechanical roar below. I gripped the rough 2x4 that served as a handrail, my knuckles white, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky cone through the gloom. "Don't look," a voice in my head whispered. It was the voice of the child I used to be, the one who hid under the covers. "If you don't look, it's not real." But I was a data analyst. I was a creature of observation. I couldn't stop looking. I descended, 10 steps, 20. The staircase went deeper than a standard basement should. We were descending past the foundation, past the root systems of the pines, into something excavated with secrecy and malice. At the bottom of the stairs, the raw wood ended and my boots hit concrete. Sticky concrete. I swept the flashlight across the floor. The beam didn't hit a wall. It hit plastic. The entire basement, a space that must have spanned the footprint of the house and the yard combined, was draped in heavy-duty, translucent painter's plastic. It hung from the ceiling beams in shimmering curtains. It covered the walls. It was taped to the floor in overlapping layers. It was a kill room the size of a warehouse. I turned off my flashlight. I didn't need it anymore. Light was bleeding through the plastic sheets from a central area about 50 yards away. It wasn't the warm yellow light of a home. It was huge portable halogen work lights, the kind used on highway construction sites at night. They cast harsh, blinding shadows against the plastic, creating a theater of silhouettes. I crouched low, making myself as small as possible, and crept forward. My boots made a wet, sucking sound on the plastic-covered floor. Squelch, squelch. I looked down. The plastic wasn't wet with water. It was slick with a thin crimson slurry. It was blood mixed with water being pushed toward a drain somewhere in the distance. I was walking in the runoff of a slaughter. I reached one of the hanging plastic curtains and used the tip of my pocket knife to slice a tiny vertical slit in the material. I brought my eye to the hole. My brain refused to process the image at first. It tried to interpret the shapes as something benign: mannequins, machinery, stage props. It tried to tell me I was looking at an art installation. But the smell wouldn't let me lie. I was looking at an assembly line. In the center of the vast concrete space illuminated by the blinding halogens stood a stainless steel table. It was bolted to the floor. It had gutters running along the sides. Standing around the table were 3 figures. They were huge, bulky. They wore bright yellow full-body hazmat suits, the kind you see in movies about viral outbreaks or nuclear cleanups. Their faces were hidden behind full-face respirators with black glass visors. They looked like astronauts of hell. They moved with a terrifying practiced efficiency. No wasted motion. No hesitation. And on the table, it was a slab of meat. That was the only way to describe it at first. It was red, wet, and raw. But then one of the yellow figures, the one holding a high-pressure water hose, stepped aside, and I saw the face. It was a man. or it had been. He was lying on his back, his chest cavity cracked open like a lobster shell. His internal organs were gone, scooped out, leaving a hollow red ribcage, but his face was untouched. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the halogen lights in frozen, eternal terror. His mouth was locked in a silent scream. I recognized him. It wasn't Julian. It was the UPS driver who delivered to my neighborhood, the guy I had waved to last week, the guy with the friendly mustache and the terrible dad jokes. He was gutted. He was empty. And standing at the foot of the table was the source of the noise. It was a wood chipper, but not the landscaping kind you tow behind a truck. This was an industrial-grade grinder, a squat, ugly beast of painted red metal bolted directly into the concrete floor. Its hopper was modified, widened to accept larger loads. A thick black hose ran from its discharge chute snake-like, disappearing into a hole that had been sledgehammered into the foundation slab, the sewer line. Grind, grind, grind. The noise was the machine idling. The hazmat figure on the left, let's call him Yellow One, picked up a reciprocating saw. The sound of the saw revving up cut through the grinder's drone like a dentist's drill hitting a nerve. Zzzt. Yellow One leaned over the UPS driver. He wasn't performing surgery. He was breaking down a carcass. He positioned the blade at the shoulder joint. I squeezed my eyes shut. I clapped my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The sound of the saw hitting bone is a vibration you feel in your teeth. It's a wet, crunching vibration. Snap. I opened my eyes. I had to watch. If I didn't watch, I wouldn't know when they were coming for me. Yellow One tossed the severed arm onto a conveyor belt that fed into the grinder. The arm moved up the belt. It reached the lip of the hopper. It tipped over. Crunch, roar, gurgle. The grinder's pitch deepened as the blades bit into the meat and bone. The machine shook violently on its mounts. A fine mist of pink spray erupted from the hopper, coating the visor of the hazmat suit standing nearest to it. Yellow 2 didn't even wipe it off. He just watched the belt. I clamped my hand over my mouth, biting into my own palm to stifle the retch that was clawing its way up my throat. Tears blurred my vision. This wasn't a crime. This was an industry. This was a factory. "Quality control," a voice boomed. I froze. The voice didn't come from the men. It came from a speaker mounted on the wall above the table. "Batch 404 processed," the speaker announced. It was the same synthesized voice I had heard from the Julian thing upstairs. Biological material recycled, calcium levels optimal, proceed to secondary extraction. Yellow 3. The largest of the group stepped away from the table. He walked over to a wall lined with metal shelving. On the shelves were glass jars, hundreds of them. They were filled with clear liquid. Floating inside each jar was something gray and convoluted. Brains. Yellow 3 picked up a jar, inspected the label, and placed it on a rolling cart. "Subject Julian Prime," the speaker announced. "Status degraded. Neuromapping complete. Biological shell slated for termination." My heart stopped. Julian Prime. I shifted my gaze to the corner of the room, past the grinder into the shadows. There was a cage there, a dog kennel but human-sized. Inside the cage, huddled in the corner, naked, shivering, and covered in filth, was a man. It was Julian. The real Julian. He looked nothing like the plastic-skinned monster upstairs. He was emaciated. His ribs poked through his skin. His hair, the trendy mullet, was matted with blood and feces. His eyes were wild, darting around the room, seeing everything but registering nothing. He had snapped. He was rocking back and forth, mouthing words I couldn't hear over the grinder. Then the speaker crackled again. "New arrival detected, Zone B stairwell access." The blood in my veins turned to ice. The music upstairs had stopped. The house knew I was here, and now it was telling the cleaners. All 3 hazmat suits stopped moving simultaneously. They didn't turn around slowly. They snapped their heads toward the plastic curtain where I was hiding. The black glass of their visors reflected the halogen lights, creating dead, insectoid eyes. Yellow 3 dropped the jar of brains. Smash. The sound of breaking glass was the starting gun. "Specimen unsecured," the speaker blared. contain, harvest. Recycle. Yellow one, the one with the saw, revved the blade. Zzz. Yellow 2 dropped the hose and picked up a cattle prod, a long black stick that crackled with a vicious blue arc of electricity. Yellow 3 just started running. He moved with terrifying speed for a man of his size. He was a tank with the agility of a linebacker. He tore through the plastic curtain I was hiding behind, ripping the heavy material as if it were tissue paper. I didn't think. I reacted. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the bloody slime. I turned and sprinted into the dark maze of the basement. "Hey!" I screamed purely out of instinct, a useless plea to the universe. "Get away!" I ducked under a hanging sheet of plastic just as Yellow 3's gloved hand swiped the air where my head had been. I heard the wind of his swing. If he had connected, he would have taken my head off. I ran blindly. The basement was a labyrinth of hanging sheets, stacked crates, and humming machinery. I didn't know the layout. I was a rat in a maze designed by a psychopath. Zzz. The saw was behind me. Close. I could hear the motor whining, hungry for bone. I took a sharp left, crashing through a stack of cardboard boxes. They tumbled around me, spilling their contents. Empty bleach bottles. Thousands of them. I slipped on a bottle, my knee hitting the concrete hard. Pain shot up my leg, blinding white hot. I scrambled up, limping now. I saw a door ahead, a metal fire door. I threw myself at it, slamming the push bar. Locked. Of course it was locked. I turned around, back pressed against the cold steel. The 3 hazmat suits were emerging from the plastic curtains, fanning out. They weren't running anymore. They were stalking. They knew I was trapped. Yellow 1 held the saw high. Yellow 2 tapped the cattle prod against his leg, sparks flying. Yellow 3 cracked his knuckles, the sound like pistol shots. They blocked the path back to the stairs. I was cornered in a dead end of the basement, surrounded by the smell of chemicals and the drone of the grinder waiting for its next meal. "Mason," the speaker voice echoed from the ceiling, "do not resist. Stress hormones spoil the meat." I looked around frantically for a weapon. Anything. To my right on a workbench sat a heavy iron pipe wrench. I grabbed it. It was heavy, cold, and solid. It felt pathetic against a chainsaw and a cattle prod, but it was better than nothing. Yellow 1 stepped forward. The saw screamed. "Come on!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Come on, you plastic freaks!" Yellow 1 lunged. He didn't swing the saw wildly. He thrust it forward, aiming for my stomach. I dodged left, the blade catching the sleeve of my flannel shirt, shredding the fabric and grazing my skin. The pain was sharp, stinging, but I didn't stop. I swung the wrench. I didn't aim for his head. I aimed for the saw. Clang! The iron wrench connected with the housing of the reciprocating saw. Sparks flew. The plastic casing of the tool shattered. The blade jammed, bucking violently in Yellow 1's hands. He stumbled back, surprised by the resistance. I didn't wait for him to recover. I kicked him. A desperate front snap kick to the center of his chest. It was like kicking a brick wall. He barely moved, but it bought me a second. Yellow 2 swung the cattle prod. I ducked. The electric arc sizzled over my hair, the static charge making my scalp prickle. I swung the wrench at Yellow 2's knee. Crack! I felt the impact vibrate up my arm. Yellow 2 grunted a low human sound, muffled by the mask, and dropped to one knee. A gap. There was a gap between them now. I sprinted through it. "Stop him!" the speaker shrieked. "Protocol 9, stop him!" I ran back toward the kill floor, toward the light. Why? Because the only other exit I'd seen was the sewer hole the grinder fed into, and I wasn't fitting down that. I needed to get back to the stairs. I burst back into the main room. The grinder was still running. The UPS driver's remains were still on the belt. And in the cage, the real Julian was screaming. "Don't let them take me! Don't let them put me in the suit!" I paused. For a split second I hesitated. Julian looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine. There was a moment of clarity in the madness. "Run," he wheezed. "It's a loop. It never ends. Run." Then the plastic curtain behind me ripped open. Yellow 3, the tank, charged out. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. He lowered his shoulder and rammed me. It felt like being hit by a car. I flew backward. The air left my lungs in a whoosh. I hit the concrete floor hard, sliding through the bloody slurry. I tumbled, rolling, until I slammed into the metal legs of the stainless steel table. My vision went black for a second. When it cleared, I was looking up. Yellow 3 was standing over me. He reached down and grabbed me by the throat with one hand. He lifted me. I'm 6 feet tall. I weigh 180 pounds. He lifted me off the ground like I was a rag doll. My feet dangled. I clawed at his glove, gasping for air, but his grip was like a hydraulic clamp. He wasn't strangling me. He was carrying me. He turned toward the conveyor belt, toward the grinder. "No!" I choked out. "No!" I kicked. I writhed, but he was immovable. He held me over the belt. The metal slats were moving beneath me, carrying chunks of the UPS driver into the red maw of the machine. Grind, grind, grind. The heat from the machine wafted up. It smelled of hot metal and death. I looked at the grinder. Then I looked at the table next to me. The water hose. The high-pressure hose Yellow 2 had dropped. It was lying on the table, still coiled, the brass nozzle gleaming. I couldn't reach it with my hands, but my legs were free. I swung my body using the momentum of my own weight. Yellow 3 tightened his grip, but he didn't expect the oscillation. I hooked my left boot around the hose. "Let go!" I screamed. I yanked my leg back. The hose snagged. It uncoiled. The heavy brass nozzle whipped through the air. It swung like a pendulum. Crack! The nozzle smashed into the black glass visor of Yellow 3's helmet. The glass spider-webbed. Yellow 3 roared in pain and surprise. He dropped me. I hit the conveyor belt hard. The metal slats bit into my back. I was moving toward the grinder. I scrambled, clawing at the sleek metal sides of the belt. My fingers slipped on the blood. The grinder was 3 feet away. 2 feet. I could see the teeth now. Rotating steel cylinders interlocking, designed to crush bone into powder. I rolled. I threw myself off the side of the belt, hitting the concrete floor just as the heel of my boot caught in the machinery. Screech. The grinder chewed the rubber heel of my boot instantly. It jerked my leg, nearly dislocating my hip before the lace snapped and my foot came free. I scrambled backward on my butt, crab walking away from the machine, gasping for air. Yellow 3 was staggering. He was clawing at his faceplate. He pulled the helmet off. I stared. Under the helmet, there was no face. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a robot. It was smooth, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, just a mouth. A vertical slit of a mouth that had been surgically stitched shut. He was a cleaner, a hollow thing, a biological drone bred for one purpose. He turned his eyeless head toward me. He sniffed the air. He could smell my fear. I scrambled to my feet. My right boot was gone. I was limping. My ribs felt broken. But the path to the stairs was open. I ran. I didn't look back at Julian in the cage. I didn't look back at the faceless man. I hit the wooden stairs and scrambled up them on all fours, splinters digging into my palms. "Seal the exit," the speaker screamed. "Containment breach, level 5 hazard." I heard the heavy footsteps of Yellow 3 hitting the stairs behind me. Thump, thump, thump. He was fast. I reached the top of the stairs. The door, the one I had braced, was hanging off its hinges. I burst into the hallway of Julian's house, the perfect Julian. The cyborg thing was there. It was waiting for me. It stood in the hallway, blocking the path to the front door. Its chest was still open, the blue light pulsing. "Leaving so soon?" it asked. Its voice was glitching, skipping syllables. "The party, party, party is not over." It raised its hand. The fingers extended, revealing needle-like blades underneath the fingernails. It lunged. I didn't try to fight it. I didn't try to dodge it. I did the only thing a data analyst knows how to do. I looked for the weak point in the system, the open chest, the wiring. I had the pocket knife still clutched in my left hand. I hadn't dropped it. As the Julian thing grabbed my shoulder, its needles sinking into my flesh, I drove the small 3-inch blade directly into the exposed cavity in its chest. I twisted. I felt the blade hit something hard. A capacitor, a pump zap. A massive electrical discharge threw me backward. The Julian thing screamed. Not a human scream, a digital shriek of feedback. It convulsed. Blue sparks erupted from its chest, showering the hallway in light. It flailed its limbs, locking up its head, spinning 360 degrees on its neck. It collapsed to the floor, twitching smoke pouring from its mouth. I didn't wait to see if it would reboot. I scrambled past the smoking chassis. I ran to the front door. It was locked, sealed tight. I looked around. The window. The living room window where Julian used to stand and wave. I picked up a heavy marble bust from a side table, a bust of Caesar, ironically, and hurled it at the glass. Smash! The safety glass shattered into 1,000,000 diamonds. I vaulted through the window shards of glass, slicing my hands and knees. I landed in the flower bed outside. The cold night air hit me. The fog, the smell of pine, it was the sweetest thing I'd ever smelled. I scrambled up and ran. I ran across the lawn, my one bare foot numb on the freezing grass. I vaulted the fence back to my property. I didn't stop at my house. I knew my house wasn't safe. The locks were a joke to them. I ran to my car. I fumbled with my keys, my bloody hands shaking so hard I dropped them twice. I looked back at the gray house. The lights were flickering, and in the broken window, I saw them. The 3 hazmat suits. They were standing there side by side, watching me. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were just observing. I got the car door open. I jammed the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw it in reverse tires, screeching, tearing up my own lawn. As I sped away down the winding road of Pinecrest, leaving the fog and the nightmare behind, I looked in the rearview mirror. The gray house was dark again, but the front door was opening, and a figure stepped out. It was Julian, perfect, smiling, wearing his cargo pants and band tee. He stood on the porch, illuminated by the porch light. He raised his hand and he waved, a stiff, robotic wave. "Goodbye, neighbor." I drove until the gaslight screamed at me, a frantic orange eye on the dashboard that mirrored my own terror. I didn't stop in the next town or the one after that. I drove 300 miles south, crossing the state line into California, my hands fused to the steering wheel in a rictus of bone-white tension. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was a black SUV. Every shadow stretching across the highway was a figure in a hazmat suit. I was vibrating with adrenaline, my body trapped in a fight-or-flight loop that wouldn't shut down my missing right boot, making it awkward to work the pedals, the cold air rushing in through the window I couldn't roll up because my hands were shaking too badly to hit the button. I checked into a moth-eaten motel off I-5 just as the sun was bleeding a bruised purple bruise across the horizon. I paid cash. I gave a fake name. I barricaded the door with the dresser, the nightstand, and the flimsy chair, creating a fortress of particle board and cheap varnish. I sat on the bed, clutching the pocket knife still stained with the blue fluid from the Julian thing's chest, and waited for the sound of servos or the smell of bleach. They didn't come. Not that night. But the silence was worse. In the silence I could still hear the grinder. It was a phantom frequency permanently etched into the cochlea of my ear. Grind. 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 I called the police the next morning. It was a decision born of exhaustion rather than hope. I sat in the sun-drenched parking lot of a diner, shivering despite the heat, and told the dispatcher a sanitized version of the truth. I told them about the intrusion, the assault, the machinery. I left out the robot. I left out the faceless men. I knew that if I mentioned the blue sparks or the eyeless faces, they would put me in a padded room before they even opened an investigation. 2 days later, I was back in Pinecrest, escorted by a sheriff's deputy and a detective who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "You said there was a manufacturing operation in the basement," the detective asked, flipping through his notebook as we stood on Julian's front porch. He eyed my bandaged feet and the scratches on my face with open skepticism. "And, body? A slaughterhouse," I corrected, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the open air. "And yes, the UPS driver? UPS. I saw him." The detective exchanged a look with the deputy. It was the look adults give a child who claims there's a monster in the closet. "All right, Mr. Mason, let's take a look." He knocked on the door. The sound echoed. Hollow, empty, no answer. "Mr. Julian," the detective called out. Silence. They used a master key provided by the property management firm. The lock tumbled. The heavy oak door swung open. I braced myself for the smell, the bleach, the rot, the ozone. But there was nothing. The air that drifted out was stale and dry. It smelled of dust and settled wood. It smelled like a house that hadn't been lived in for years. We stepped into the foyer. I looked at the floor. The spot where the hundreds of muddy shoes had been lined up was pristine. The hardwood gleamed, reflecting the sunlight streaming through the transom window. There wasn't a scuff mark. There wasn't a speck of red clay. "The shoes," I whispered, pointing at the empty floor. There were hundreds of them." "Uh-huh," the detective said, not writing anything down. We moved to the living room. The window, the one I'd shattered with the bust of Caesar, was intact. I walked up to it, running my finger over the glass. It wasn't new glass. It was dusty. There was a spider web in the corner of the frame. "I broke this," I said, my voice trembling. "I threw a statue through it." "Doesn't look broken to me, son," the deputy muttered. "They fixed it. They fix everything." We went to the hallway. I looked for the scorch marks on the floor where the cyborg had convulsed. I looked for the blue fluid. Nothing. Just clean, uninterrupted oak planks. "The basement," I said, desperation clawing at my throat. "Check the basement. That's where the machine is. That's where the drain is." I led them to the door under the stairs. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking. I pulled it open. Wooden stairs, raw lumber, just like I remembered. "See," I said, "unfinished." We went down. But at the bottom, there was no plastic, no concrete kill floor, no stainless steel table. The basement was dirt, just a dirt floor, packed hard. There were cobwebs draping from the ceiling joists that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in a decade. There was no plumbing rough in, no electrical drops for heavy machinery, no sewer connection. It was just a hole in the ground. I fell to my knees, clawing at the dirt. It was here, the concrete was here. They dug it up. They filled it in. The detective grabbed me by the arm, hauling me up. "Okay, that's enough. Mr. Mason, are you currently under the care of a psychiatrist? Any history of episodes?" "I am not crazy," I screamed, the sound echoing in the empty dirt grave. "They wiped it. Don't you understand? That's what they do. They clean." "This house has been vacant for 5 years," the deputy said, looking at his phone. "Property records show it's owned by a holding company in Delaware. No tenant since 2019. "I spoke to him," I yelled. "Julian, he drove a BMW, he played music. We checked the neighbors, sir." The detective said, his voice dropping to that soothing, patronizing tone used for jumpers on a ledge. "We knocked on the doors on both sides. They said they've never heard a sound coming from this house. They said they've never seen a car in the driveway." I looked at them. I looked at the dusty, empty basement. They had erased him. They hadn't just cleaned up the blood, they had edited reality. They had scrubbed the timeline. The gaslighting was total. It was absolute. I left Pinecrest that day. I didn't even pack. I left my furniture, my clothes, my servers. I just got in my car and drove. I couldn't stay in a world where the evidence of my own eyes could be deleted overnight. I moved to Chicago. I figured the noise of a city, the constant chaos of millions of people would keep me safe. It's hard to make someone disappear in a crowd, right? It's hard to run a wood chipper in an apartment complex without someone complaining about the noise. I got a job doing low-level IT support. No more data analysis. No more looking for patterns. I didn't want to see patterns anymore. I wanted chaos. I wanted randomness. I lived in a fourth-floor walk-up with thin walls. I loved the thin walls. I could hear my neighbor arguing with his wife. I could hear the TV from the unit above. I could hear the sirens outside. It was real. It was messy. It was human. 6 months passed. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became manageable. I stopped smelling bleach every time I opened a bottle of water. I started to believe just a little bit that Maybe I had snapped. Maybe the isolation had broken my brain. Maybe Julian was a hallucination, a manifestation of my own loneliness and guilt. It was a comforting thought. It was better to be crazy than to be right. Then the package arrived. It was a Tuesday. I came home from work exhausted, the gray slush of a Chicago winter clinging to my boots. The package was sitting in front of my door. It was a small box wrapped in brown butcher paper. No return address. My name was written on it in pencil, hand-printed, block letters, Mason. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't want to touch it. But curiosity is a disease, and I was terminal. I carried it inside. I placed it on my kitchen table. I used a steak knife to slit the tape. Inside, nestled in black foam, was a digital voice recorder. It wasn't a cheap one. It was a high-end field recorder, the kind used by sound engineers or surveillance experts. The brand was Sony. There was a sticky note attached to it. For your collection. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the device. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up. File 001.wav, length 0800008 hours. I pressed play. For the first few minutes there was nothing but silence. Then a rustle. Then a sound I recognized instantly. Snort, wheeze. It was a snore. My snore. I listened, the blood draining from my face. I heard the sound of a heavy truck passing by outside the garbage truck that comes every Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. This wasn't an old recording. This was recent. I fast-forwarded. Click. The sound of a door opening. My apartment door. I looked at my door. The deadbolt was engaged. It had been engaged every night. On the recording, footsteps entered, soft, calculated. Not the heavy boots of the hazmat suits, but something lighter. Squeak. That was the loose floorboard in my hallway. The footsteps moved closer to the microphone. The recording quality changed, becoming clearer, closer. The recorder wasn't in the room with me when this happened. The recorder was the person. I heard the sound of fabric rustling. Someone was standing right next to my bed. I held my breath listening to the recording of myself sleeping 6 inches away from an intruder. Then a voice. It wasn't the synthesized voice of the Julian thing. It wasn't the flat monotone of the cleaners. It was a woman's voice, soft, almost affectionate. "He looks peaceful," she whispered. "Does he fit?" A man's voice replied. It was Julian's voice, not the robot. The new Julian, the one I saw on the porch. "Measurements confirmed," the woman said. I heard the zip-zip of a measuring tape being pulled out and retracted. Cranial circumference is a match for the new processor. Limb length is within tolerance for the worker model. I stared at the recorder, tears streaming down my face. They had been in my room last night. While I dreamed of safety, they were measuring me for a suit. "Do we take him now?" the woman asked. There was a pause on the tape. A long, heavy silence where the only sound was my own rhythmic breathing, unaware that I was being assessed for spare parts. "No," Julian's voice said. It sounded amused. "The queue is full this week, and besides, he is good data. Let him ripen. Fear marinates the meat." "Understood," the woman said, "leaving a token." Click. The recording ended. I sat there in my kitchen, the silence of the apartment suddenly feeling very different. It wasn't the silence of privacy. It was the silence of a cage before the door is locked. I looked around the room. I looked at the vents. I looked at the smoke detector. I looked at the gap under the door. They knew where I was. They had always known. They didn't let me escape. They released me. I wasn't a survivor. I was free-range livestock. I was just wandering the pasture until the slaughter truck came back around. I stood up, grabbing a hammer from my tool drawer. I smashed the recorder. I smashed it until it was plastic dust and silicon shards. But as the pieces flew, I saw something under the foam padding of the box. A photograph. I picked it up. It was a grainy black-and-white photo taken from a high angle. It showed a bedroom. My bedroom. It showed me sleeping in my bed, mouth slightly open. And standing over me, tall and pale in the darkness, were three figures. They weren't wearing hazmat suits, they were naked, their bodies were smooth, hairless, and white. Their chests were stitched shut with thick black thread. They were all holding hands forming a circle around my bed, and they were all smiling. I dropped the photo. I ran to the window and looked down at the street 4 stories below. Parked across the street, idling in the no parking zone, was a black SUV. The windows were tinted, the engine was purring, and standing on the sidewalk looking up at my window was a man in a business suit. He had a mullet. He was holding a cup of coffee that wasn't steaming. He saw me. He raised the cup in a toast. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He held it to his ear. My phone rang. It was lying on the table next to the smashed recorder. The screen lit up. Unknown number. I didn't answer it. I didn't have to. I knew what the voice on the other end would say. I knew that if I picked it up, I would hear that looped laughter. Ha 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 he. I backed away from the window. I backed away from the door. There is nowhere to run. You understand that, right? That's why I'm telling you this, not to save myself. It's too late for me. The measurements are taken. The suit is ready. I'm telling you this because of the noise. Have you ever heard it? Late at night when the house is quiet, a low rhythmic thrumming in the walls. Maybe you thought it was the HVAC system. Maybe you thought it was a truck idling down the block. Maybe you thought it was just the blood rushing in your ears. Don't go look. If your neighbor plays loud music on a Tuesday night, don't complain. Put in earplugs. If you see a car that never moves, don't stare. And for God's sake, if you find a package at your door that you didn't order, don't open it. Because they are not just in Pinecrest, they are everywhere. They are the maintenance crew of reality, and they are always hiring. The phone is still ringing. I think I have to answer it. It's rude to keep the neighbors waiting. Click.